Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. On September 1st, this very day in 1923, one of the worst natural disasters, the Great Kanto Earthquake, hit Japan. At that time, when a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck Tokyo, Yokohama, and its surrounding areas, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. Shortly after the temblor, groundless rumors had suggested that ethnic Koreans had launched riots and poisoned wells. And this caused the brutal slaughtering of Koreans with an estimated death toll of 6,661. A century has passed, but still, the exact number of deaths is not well documented, and the Japanese government is saying there are no records to support Japan having even carried out such a massacre. Why is Japan not recognizing the truth of the past? And would this in any way affect the recently thawed bilateral ties between Seoul and Tokyo? Marking the 100th anniversary of the earthquake and atrocities afterward, Within the Frame aims to delve deeper into the tragic event. And for this, we invite Professor Im Eun-jung from Gwangju National University. Professor Im, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. And we also have Professor Alexis DUDDEN at the University of Connecticut. Thank you for your time, Professor DUDDEN.
Thank you so much for including me.
Thank you. Now, our first question, Professor Im, first, let's talk about how this tragic incident happened. I mean, what led Koreans to be massacred after a massive earthquake?
Well, as you just explained, 100 years ago on September 1st, 1923, a magnitude 7.9 great earthquake struck the Kanto region of Japan, including Tokyo. And the whole city was devastated, almost like 44% of the whole Tokyo just burned into the ground. But the thing is, the sparks of this massive disaster fell on innocent Korean people who lived in Japan then. About an hour after the earthquake struck the region, the rumors like, again, the Koreans setting fires or like poisoning wells began to spread, and the indiscriminate killings of Koreans began that evening. We Korean think this massacre as a organized state crime, rather than a just accidental crime by just ordinary citizens. There is a reason why we think so, because the Japanese government, which in theory was supposed to crack down on rumors, instead they rather encourage that. We feel like it's scapegoated again the Koreans to create a rationale for martial law to control over the chaotic situations. At the time, Fumio Goto, who then served as the one who is in charge of warning at the Homeland Security Home Ministry, sent a telegram to the provinces stating, we, quote again, we are having a hard time with arson by Koreans, so we have imposed martial law, so please crack down strictly in each province. So this was an important actually factor in stirring up resentment or like xenophobia against the Koreans. So soldier, police, or like vigilantes, they participated in this, again, the massacre.
Right, I see. Professor DUDDEN, it is quite surprising that not just soldiers and policemen, but also Japanese civilians, though they were vigilantes, participated in this indiscriminate slaughter. And Professor Im said that this could have been organized by the state itself. Do you believe this could be attributed to the slaughtering by civilians?
Absolutely. And forgive, I have a little cold this morning, but learning from Professor Im is extremely important. She's the expert. Important for everybody to know is there was a category of criminality at the time in Japan that literally made it a criminal offense to be Korean, sennin. And so it is not surprising that if the police said, let's go round up, the terms used at the time, hunting Koreans, hunting people, So no, it's unfortunately deeply distressing and true.
Right, I see. It was such a tragic incident. Professor Dudden, one more question. The Korean Provisional Government's Tongnip Sinmun newspaper issued on December 5th, 1923, put the total number of death toll at 6,661. However, the number varies even now as far as I know. Why is this so?
Well, as Professor Im also mentioned, the number is definitely in the several thousands. One of the tricky parts of doing any history of a mass disaster is getting an exact number. And so, how many the DNA evidence of bone shards, things like that. And so it relies on families knowing who was lost, neighbors knowing who was lost. And if people weren't registered, if they happened to just be there for labor, if they happened to be visiting a family member and disappeared in the slaughter and or the earthquake's disaster, it's difficult to know.
Right, I see. Well, in my opinion, admitting that such a tragic event occurred is one thing, but another important thing is making up for the incident. And that being said, Professor Im, since the massacre, what has been the Japanese government's stance on this?
Well, the Kanto massacre is one of the most obscure event. This is because for 100 years, again, the Japanese government has consistently evaded responsibility. What they basically keep trying to emphasize is, there is no clear document-like evidence. This is actually pretty similar logic that the Japanese government applies to the issue of comfort women, for example, or forced labor as well. Well, what they keep, again, in a press conference, for example, 2 days ago, Chief Cabinet Secretary Mr. Matsuno Hirokazu only said that, we recognize that it is a very important task to work to ensure the safety and security of all victims, regardless of nationality, in the event of a disaster. But he did not actually mention anything apologetic or anything related to the reflection or lessons from the past and so on. So, for example, Tokyo Shimbun, Tokyo Daily News, they reported that, again, the Mr. Matsuno did not directly refer to the massacre of the Korean people and expressed a little negative reactions to the further, investigation. And actually, the newspaper criticized it. They argue that, we need to face the actual fact. So, the Japanese government has been always very much technically, how would you say, correct by their own time, or they have been more elusive, again, technically or legally. But, from Korean people's point of view, we are not talking about all this kind of just, specific numbers or all those things. So, there has been always a kind of huge recognition gap between the Japanese government stance and the Korean people, how Korean people feel.
Right, I see. Professor Im, you have already mentioned that Chief Cabinet Secretary said that there's no record within the government to ascertain the truth regarding this massacre. Why has such massacre denier been internalized in Japanese society?
Well, I think when we talk about this kind of issue, I think we definitely need to distinguish the Japanese government and Japanese civil society, for example. Because when asked, as you just explained, again, when asked to comment on the government's position on the massacre, again, Mr. Matsuno, like government officer, has been more evasive or saying, if we limit we of course refer to the Japanese government. If they limit ourselves to the government investigation, they said no records have been found to determine the facts. However, again, for example, Japan's Japan's Bar Association or other civil society organizations, they have been actively shedding light on this issue. So in Japan now, as far as I know, more than like 190 experts and 130 civil society groups, they have organized the executive committee for the 100th anniversary of this massacre. And they are, again, trying to, how would you say, to raise the attention from the society as well.
Right, I see. Though there are some group of people who are trying to shed light upon this incident, there are definitely some people who are trying to evade this truth. And Professor DUDDEN, I would like to talk about this impact, the impact this kind of denial or such an evasive posture can have. First of all, what impact could such a distortion of events have in terms of history and facts?
Well, again, Professor Im is the expert, and it is so good to listen to her understanding. The current governor of Tokyo, Governor Koike, has been singularly disdainful of this history. And I think, as Professor Im mentioned, Japanese civil society, for over 50 years, has been really trying to make this history better known. There are monuments to the dead in downtown Tokyo, in Yokohama. Governor Koike has tried to ignore the fact that Japanese people themselves recognize their own responsibility in this history. And so the effect on history is the way that denialism works in all efforts to erase in an internal past. It fails. It temporarily will win votes in a democracy, but it makes the other views only get stronger, in my understanding. And so it's unfortunate that Governor Koike has staked her reputation on pretending that this history didn't happen.
Right, I see your point. Professor DUDDEN, one more question. One historian pointed out that refusing to acknowledge the Kanto earthquake massacre could also be risky for Japan, as there is a possibility that rumors and lies that could lead to crime might emerge again if another natural disaster occurs. What's your view on this?
It's twofold in the sense that, yes, and this is especially in the United States, denying internal histories of racial violence is always bad. And so I think here of the immediate wake of the 9/11 attacks, the 2001 attacks in the United States, in which many people immediately said, do not attack people, do not attack Muslim Americans, because we have this history, this horrible history of attacking Japanese Americans. What's really important for a lot of viewers to understand is one of the critical pieces of evidence in this history from this history in 1923 came from Japanese school children who were asked to draw reflections of their memories of that day. We're talking about 5, 6, 7-year-olds who drew pictures of what they saw. And what they saw was fellow Japanese people killing Koreans. And those documents actually count as historical evidence as much as the Japanese government, or at least some parts of the Japanese government, would like to deny.
Right, I see. We'd have to remember that denying its own history will only fail. Now, Professor Im, some say denying the Kanto earthquake massacre of Koreans could generate hate speech toward foreigners as well and encourage Japanese people to have such a mindset. Do you agree?
Well, there are, of course, many other different reasons for the rise of hatred. I'm sorry, I felt a little emotional when I was listening to Professor Dodden's explanation. However, anyhow, there can be many different reasons for the rise of hatred in any society. I think there's not just say a single reason. Japan, for example, is one of the oldest society in the world, the most aged society, and its population has been shrinking, and has spent several decades with a very stagnated economic situations. So they didn't have a good momentum for the further growth. So to fill those labor shortage, many migrants came to Japan, but the Japanese society, as we know, is pretty much conservative when it comes to the migration issues. And in addition to this, SNS or social media like platform developed, and the internet, YouTube, all the things have led to the so-called confirmation bias in favor of certain voices. So, there can be many different reasons, but personally, I do think society that has stopped growing or have a kind of shrinking population. I think that kind of society really needs to be much more open to the rest of the world, or even respectful to the minority voices. Otherwise, it's going to be just collapsing internally. So I think many Japanese people do know this, and many of them, I think, are fighting for that.
Right, I see. I cannot agree more. Professor Dudden, we have been talking about Japan's responses overall, but has the Korean government ever properly raised the issue of the Korean massacre? And do you believe such efforts were enough?
There have been efforts made. Right now, however, we are in a moment in which the current government in South Korea does not want to discuss history. And or does not want to recognize that historical wrongdoing actually continues to affect present relations. As Professor Im was mentioning, many Japanese have debated about this. Many Koreans have debated about this. And I think what may be important and could be something that President Yoon could raise is that in Japan, targeting ethnic Koreans continues to lead to daily life violence for ethnic Koreans or people of Korean descent in Japan, and that this is a responsibility of the South Korean government, which equally has happened in the past. At the moment, there seems to be an effort to try to avoid that issue. At the same time, the connections and the historical relations between the two countries make that unavoidable.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Lim, shifting gears a little bit here to the bilateral ties. Seoul-Tokyo ties were frozen for a long time, and just recently have been seeing a thaw, right? Given that the Yoon administration has apparently shown concessions and what other media outlets says a brave decision on historical issues recently, some could say Japan's remarks or moves are not sincere enough. Do you believe Japan's lack of sincerity regarding this issue in any way could affect bilateral ties?
Well, at this point, again, the Yoon administration believes it is important to deter effectively, again, a threat from North Korea more than anything else. I personally, and I think many of my Korean fellows also would agree with that approach. Again, we definitely need to effectively, again, deter North Korea. And in order to achieve that goal, we need to cooperate with Japan, which is strategically, of course, geostrategically very much important. And it is also another liberal democracy. So definitely I think Korean people, we are very realistic people, pragmatic people, and many of us would would understand the importance of the security cooperation with Japan. However, that does not necessarily mean that we need to just chip up our mouth to anything that happened in the past, because, as having had this kind of further, how would you say, improvement in the bilateral relations, I think we can talk more honestly about what really happened and what really should be avoided in the future for our generation, our next generation, for both countries again. So I hope, the both leaders or leaderships of the two countries can separate the cooperation issues from all this, something that happened in the past. This is, I think, a good opportunity actually for the two leadership, to talk more straightforward and honestly, because now again the societies became more mature than before, even Japanese society too, and now we do have a good rationale for the further cooperation.
Right, I cannot agree more. I hope two countries' leaders could talk more honestly about historical issues as well. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor DUDDEN. We haven't keep talking about Japan's posture and Japan's response, but how about us? What can the Korean government and Korean people do in order to not forget this tragic massacre?
Well, I think, as Professor Im just put beautifully, it is a moment for the Korean government, the Yoon administration, to say, okay, we want good ties with Japan. That does not have to come at the expense of historical truth. And that's something that South Korea is probably, in my humble estimation, one of the most successful democracies definitely in Asia, if not the world. And so part of that is a responsibility to the country's own history. And when there are relations with other countries that are really difficult, it's important to educate, it's important to learn, and it is certainly important not to deny one's own people's place in that. Why were the Koreans there? Who were the Koreans who were there at the time in 1923? Why is it still a problem in Japan today? And how is the very word Korean used in Japanese society? Because it's very different from how most Koreans use the word Japan. And it's something that I do think that a democratically elected government has the responsibility to give voice to.
Right, I believe what Professor DUDDEN says is what we really need to think about for our better ties between Seoul and Tokyo. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Im and Professor DUDDEN, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.